All right. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to ESAS after, what's it been, 2 weekends without it? I missed you. I'm sure you didn't miss me. Maybe you did. I don't know. I've forgotten how to stream smoothly, apparently. I'm just rambling. But yeah, welcome back to ESAS. Today we're going to be continuing with the Bloodborne analysis by Acer Aesthetics. As was said in the last stream that we did on this, we got 20 minutes in, and I got about an hour and a half of talking about it out of it. So yeah, this should be a fun stream, just going over different things that this wonderful gentleman has to say and things that I have to say on top of it. So should be an interesting stream. A couple little updates real quick. I have been working on the Skyrim commentary, and it is coming along pretty well. I'm debating on if I want to have it be a thing where I do sort of each main quest line as sort of its own individual video and just try to get them out rather quickly as opposed to doing one massive video and then getting it out, because I'm going to have to split things anyway. So if I could get things out a little faster, I might actually have more motivation to work on it and get it done. So I'm debating that still. We will continue to work on those in the meantime, and we'll see what's up. But yeah, moving along pretty well with that, and I will continue to work on that for the next probably through the end of April. I'll continue working on that, and then depending on progress, I might continue working on it and just try to get the Skyrim thing done. But if I feel differently about it, I might take a couple months to work on another commentary that I have planned for Dying Light the following. So that's kind of how things are going to go on the commentary front. And I forget if I announced this in the last stream or if I had it set up by then, but I now have different channels doing different things. So there is an ESAS backup channel. It is you can go to the main channel in the community section. There are links, or you can go to the main page of Papa Vangaris and you can find the links to the ESAS archive. You can find the gaming channel where all of my more chill gaming stuff goes. And I've also got a music channel I'm setting up because I like to jam and I'd like to do more jammy whammy shit. So we'll see how that goes as it goes along. But without further ado, let's bring in this wonderful video on Bloodborne. And we ended sort of in the middle of him saying something, so I'm going to try to back it up a little bit just so we can get some extra context to things. We'll see how it goes, but let's just jump back in.
Apps would have had a much lower hit rate than before. Thankfully, though, the player is still given enough incentives to thoroughly explore and familiarize themselves with the environments, with items strewn all over the map and NPCs, especially in the early game, who stay behind locked doors or windows and can give the player direction or some piece of world building.
Gilbert would have done both if I'd have exhausted his dialogue. He'd have instructed us to reach cathedral wards through the aqueduct, and he'd remind us of what's happening in the world.
Since we spend most of our time in the game in said world, it probably doesn't need repeating, but it's not like him reminding us that there's an ongoing hunt is hurting either. I'm about to fight the cleric beast, and for the sake of brevity, I'll be skipping the enemies on this bridge. In this fight, I intend to make liberal use of the Molotov cocktails. I wasn't joking when I said I like to throw things in these games. But I want to bring up that the player should know that this is a smart strategy at this point in the game. The bridge leading to the cleric beast has 2 scourge beasts on it, which should invite flame attacks if the player paid attention to the opening cutscene, and the player should also know fire is effective against beasts if they've paid attention to how the level so far has heavily emphasized fire as a weapon against beasts. In the giant strung up corpse we walked past earlier, the torches wielded by the villagers, and by reading the in-game description of the cocktail itself.
There's a one thing to mention too is the intro cinematic does a very subtle job of letting you know that, beasts come from blood, but fire repels them, as you can remember from the intro cutscene of the game. So another little thing that's a little bit more subtle than just the cocktail saying, hey, beasts burn. It's fun to burn them, But just a little addition to that.
Fire is a particularly powerful weapon against beasts, which is always sort of weird in these games because aside from the Watchdog in the Chalice Dungeon and Lawrence in the Nightmare, no enemy in this game seems like they have a good time against fires, but nitpicks aside, it's a go-to weapon against beasts.
The Cleric Beast fight is triggered when the player reaches
Close enough to the wall it jumps down, a setup eerily similar to the Taurus Demon fight in Dark Souls. These two bosses also share the distinction of being their game's most commonly accepted first boss tutorial in Dark Souls aside.
I mean, I think I get what he's like kind of going for with saying this is the first boss. You know, he's basically doing the audio equivalent of quote unquote with the way he's saying it, but it is one of those things where I think you can make an argument that the Asylum Demon is a little bit not as much of a boss as it is just kind of an encounter to kind of get you from A to B. But if you wanted to be technical, it is the technical first boss of Dark Souls 1. And I was going to say that this fight, you know, with the enemy basically jumping down from above out of sight is also equivalent to what happened in Dark Souls 1 with the Asylum Demon. The Taurus Demon works with what he's doing. It just would have been better, in my opinion, to use the Asylum Demon as an example.
Both are massive hairy beasts with horns and humanoid physiques, and both are fought on these linear pathways. Gameplay-wise, however, the Cleric Beast harkens more so back to Manus from that game's DLC, but with all of the jumping around and having one oversized hand. Manus was an impressive boss in that game, and it almost seems like the Cleric Beast is Miyazaki's way of letting players know just how much higher the stakes are this time around. Recycling the strongest boss of the last game, aside from maybe Calamite, to be the first boss in this game seems to me to communicate as much. Anyway.
This is one thing that I think that some of us get sort of wrapped up in when it comes to talking about these games is a lot of people like to draw comparisons to things, and sometimes, like what he just said about Manus sort of being the hardest boss of Dark Souls, and then kind of having the Cleric Beast have the one big arm, kind of like Manus does. It's one of those things where I feel like this community can read into things a little bit more than they might necessarily need to. Because as far as I'm aware, and forgive me if I'm wrong, as far as I'm aware, there's no real reason why the Cleric Beast has one big arm the way it does. It's just a part of the transformation that made it that way. And again, I might be completely fucking wrong. There might be an explanation for why it has such a big arm, and maybe it is a direct reference to Manus as far as I know. But this is one thing that I've seen in communities like this where people like these games deserve to be looked into like deeply, but I do think some people look a little too hard and draw connections that probably aren't as deep as we initially think. And this is a thing where I'm not saying this is a problem with this video or his interpretation of what's going on, but it is kind of a thing where I have to wonder like how much of this is actually intended to remind you of Manus with this fight with the one arm thing, or if it's just a thing where Miyazaki just likes enemies with like wonky proportions. It's like how deep does this actually go, sort of a thing. And so that's one thing that I do kind of have some problems with this community in general. Not his, but just the Soulsborne Ring community in general is they tend to read into everything super deeply. And sometimes I feel like that's a little unnecessary, but to each their own. I just kind of wanted to throw that out there before we get deeper into this.
When we triggered the Cleric Beast boss, we were granted one insight, and when we killed it, we were granted 3 more. Having insight makes us able to see and interact with a doll in the hunter's dream. The insight mechanic is a modification of the humanity mechanic from Dark Souls with some Call of Cthulhu sanity stat thrown in for good measure. The doll is the level up lady of this game, and she's probably the most popular one in the From Software lineup.
I mean, if you want to go by popular, I think there's a strong argument to be made that, while Bloodborne's doll is a popular sort of, level upper or person you go through to level up, I'm sure that there are just as many people who probably like a lot of the other ones. And this is one of those things where if I was making this video, I probably wouldn't bring that up just because, I'm sure that there are tons of people that like this one over others, but there's probably just as many who like a different one over this. It's one of those things where I've found when making a video, sometimes you kind of let your opinions slide in as fact when really they are just an opinion, and that's one thing that I've learned after making several videos like this, where if it is a hard opinion, in terms of like a favorite of the sort of hub level up queens or what have you, it's usually a good idea to kind of qualify that by saying it's my personal favorite, but you're free to think what like kind of continue on. And this is one thing where you wonder if this is his opinion reflecting upon the game because maybe this is his favorite game from Software's catalog and stuff like that. It's one of those things that kind of takes you out of the experience a little bit when you get an opinion that seems to come across as a fact when there are probably several factors that you could use to prove it wrong. It's a experience that sort of makes the viewing audience a little jarred whenever you say something that sounds like a fact when it's basically just an opinion, and there's probably strong evidence against it, right? Like, as far as I can tell, Bloodborne, I think, has sold a couple million copies. I'm not sure if it's like 3, 5, whatever it is, but I know it's not sold as much as Dark Souls 3. And I know it has not sold as much as Elden Ring. And Dark Souls 3 and Elden Ring both have a hub level up maiden like this game does, right? So I mean, you could argue that this was, a popular one at the time because this is kind of the first one where, she's not really annoying as much as the, Emerald Herald was. But you can kind of make an argument one way or the other. I just think him saying it out loud like that, and just probably the most popular one of all of them, is just kind of you're letting your opinion probably seep into the video where it should be viewed as an opinion, not as a definitive statement like he just said. Then again, he might qualify it in the next like 5 seconds, so who knows.
And she's probably the most popular one in the From Software lineup. She was constructed by Gurman to be a replica of his old student Maria, which seems to have been retconned in with the DLC. And
I mean, that's one thing. Like that's true, right? It's supposed to be based off of. Wow, I just forgot her name, and he just said it. Wow, fuck, Maria. Yeah, it's supposed to be based off of that, right? So, it's one of those things where. It's one of those things where I don't want to go a little too hard on the exact language used in this, just because I'm not sure if this is someone from it's like with the accent coming from the speaker of the video. I wonder if like how good their English is in terms of a total comprehension of it. Which I don't blame. Like I'm the only language I speak is English, and I don't fucking know everything about it. But it does make me wonder if some of the points I'm going to make in this video throughout it are going to be based off of sort of a dialect difference, where he might use a word thinking one thing and then other people will think something else from it, and just it leads to confusion. And so I just wonder if that's going to be an issue throughout this. But saying that it was retconned in by Maria existing feels like a little bit of a unnecessary stretch of a point in a way, because as far as I can tell, there's nothing that gives you one answer in the base game that the DLC negates, from what I understand. And maybe he brings it up in a second, but in my experience from playing the game, just she was modeled, the doll was modeled after Maria, and that was it. And it's not really a retcon. Retcons are typically thought of as things that change a previous rule, right? Things that change something established previously, right? That's usually what is thought of as a retcon. And I just think it's a bad wording on the part of Acer Aesthetics there.
And I think the reason she's the most popular level lady has to do with how unique she is in this lineup. Because of how much time we spend with them, Some characters can naturally come to take the role of supporting cast without the game telling you that that's what they are, and I feel that the doll really benefits from how deeply she is tied to the world. As in, this character could not function in any other game.
So many
I mean, that's kind of a really broad statement that is like a lot of the firekeepers and the level up people in these games are pretty interchangeable, right? It's just a matter of like what do they actually do in the story that's sort of different, right? Like you can take the doll and replace her with the Dark Souls 3 maiden firekeeper and it's essentially the same. Like the only difference is like the outfits and maybe the cutscenes that show. It's like the doll is not, and this is one thing that I don't quite know kind of what order he's tackling these videos in, right? Let me check something. This came out 3 years ago. This came out March 21st, 2021. Okay. Okay, so fair enough. Elden Ring had not come out yet, but Dark Souls 3 had come out, right? And Dark Souls 3, by most metrics, was a runaway success for From Software, compared to all the other games, right? Like a lot of people picked up Dark Souls 3. And it's just one of those things where, again, it seems like his opinion of this particular level up maiden being his favorite is coloring his sort of objective lens of the world. And it comes across as sort of you're making your opinion seem like fact when it really is just an opinion, right? Now, granted, I got nothing wrong. I got no problem with the doll, the design, the way it works, the way she functions in terms of the endings and the stories and what you glean from her throughout the game. I got no problem with that. I think it's like most From Software like hub characters. They're pretty cool. Like they're pretty interesting. They help you do what you need to, and you get interesting details about the world and them, throughout the game. I do think he's stretching it a little bit to make this character seem more quote unquote special by comparison to all the other games sort of roles that have a similar function. But it is one of those things where, it's like she is unique to this game because this game is unique in From Software's like sort of discography. And that's not to say that it's better or worse than anything. It's just unique because it's a different take on that sort of melee focused, difficult, atmospheric sort of subtle world building and design that you typically see in their games. It's like this is kind of a unique gem amongst a series of gems, right? So it's not necessarily better or worse. It's just different, and it's different from the other ones. And one thing that he does say too that I kind of disagree with is the whole thing of her being not interchangeable or her being very unique. And it's like, that's kind of not true. I mean, that's kind of not true. I say kind of instead of a hard not true because, you can replace certain characters at certain points in certain games and they basically function the same, but they also, do have different things in them in the game, that make them sort of a evolution of a previous idea, but not necessarily a copy. But you could still copy and paste things here and there, and they would basically work the same, apart from a couple things here or there. So it's one of those weird points where, again, feels like he's taking his opinion of Bloodborne and kind of unknowingly pushing it as a fact that this is the best version, this is the best character, this is the best, level up helper, supporting character type of thing, which can kind of turn people off to the video. Again, I don't have a problem with the doll. Don't have a problem with him thinking the doll is the best one or having an opinion that she's his favorite, right? That's not the issue. The issue is that he's conflating his opinion with fact.
Of Bloodborne's is deviations from reality and game design conventions are utilized in telling her story. I've noted my affinity for this sort of storytelling before, and I'll talk about it again in this video later. The way leveling is contextualized in this world is very different from how it was in the Souls games, but functionally it's not all that dissimilar from Demon Souls. Both games have the player go to their save hub where the level lady transforms their XP/currency, which they got from killing enemies or using items, into level ups. Both games also had a static character in the save hub, The monumental in Demon Souls, Gurman here. And you can tell that it's Gurman by how it's him.
I am Gammon.
I really like Gurman. He doesn't fill any mechanics role gameplay-wise up until the end, but he gives us some lore and some context for the happenings in the story. Additionally, him being the first hunter makes him sort of impressive of a figure, even considering his seemingly feeble stature at this point. I can't remember ever thinking he was anything else than a final boss waiting to happen. Throughout the game, the players will unlock a bit more of his dialogue, and in a way, I've always felt like he was kind of like the hunter's mentor in this game. There's no training moment or anything like that, but he's the old guy you keep coming back to in between levels, and that role to me just sort of wraps itself on top of him. Which goes back to what I said about how some characters naturally slot into the supporting cast. Even if he wasn't a main game boss, I think Gurman is a character players would have very much had an affinity for. The Hunter's Dream picks up where Demon Souls' Nexus left off, what with it being where players will usually go for upgrades and merchants, except
This is one thing that I think is worth mentioning as well, is just the amount of times that a FromSoft game has taken from Demon Souls and put it into a game in the future, even when it actively should not be a part of the franchise, i.e., Dark Souls 2 and 3, is kind of annoying. Was kind of annoying to me that they constantly took stuff from Demon Souls when they had a lot of good shit in Dark Souls 1 as well. It's one thing I'm very grateful that Elden Ring did expand upon, because when you look at, in terms of the game's releasing, right, you have Demon Souls hub is your area that you come back to constantly for upgrades and leveling and all that other shit, right? And then you get to Dark Souls 1, and it's a little bit more freeform. You upgrade your weapons a couple times at key points, but once you buy gear, you can use the bonfires to do everything, which I think is a neat detail and a nice change where you don't have to constantly come back to the hub, right? And that's a good way to have consistent gameplay going on, right? Because one of my biggest problems with Dark Souls 2, that was also a problem with Demon Souls and Bloodborne and Dark Souls 3, was that in order to level up, you have to go back to your hub. You have to keep going back to your hub. You have to keep fucking going back to your hub, right? And it's just a thing where it takes you out of the experience so often when instead of just killing a boss, leveling up at the bonfire after them, and then continuing to go, you have to warp back somewhere, talk to somebody, level up, upgrade, do whatever you want to do, and then you have to warp back. It's basically just an extension of the process that they already found a solution with the bonfire in Dark Souls 1 by letting you upgrade weapons at it and by letting you level up at the bonfires in question, right? And this is one thing again. The bonfires were one of the best creations From Software ever made for their franchises, and the fact that the only other one that used them in the same light was Elden Ring shows you a lot about how much good shit they miss moving forward in the franchises that they create, right? It's one of the things that eternally baffles me. And I've ranted about this in my Dark Souls 2 and 3 videos about the bonfire and how useful it is in Dark Souls 1 and how it was basically cucked in every game after that, right? And it is a thing where new franchises, you can do something similar or something new, and this is one thing where I don't have as much a problem with Bloodborne's hub and the way you level up in that game compared to Dark Souls 2 and 3, because Bloodborne is its own universe. It can do its own thing. It doesn't have to be a carbon copy of how Dark Souls 1 did it. But at the same time, Dark Souls 1 made a lot of good strides in terms of keeping the game constantly going, right? Because when you have a game like Dark Souls where you can go from bonfire to bonfire to bonfire to bonfire to bonfire and just keep on playing the game while leveling up, while upgrading your weapons, while, turning yourself online or offline or like hollowing or unhollowing, getting in your human form. Being able to do all of that from the bonfires is a great way to keep the player playing the game and progressing through the game. That's one of the greatest strengths of the bonfire system in Dark Souls 1. It has a lot of other benefits too, but that's the main thing, is that you don't have to go anywhere. You rest, you recuperate, you gain strength from it, you upgrade from it if you have the right gear, and then you continue on. Your adventure is interrupted by a brief respite, and then you go. Now, people can make that same argument for Dark Souls 2 and 3 and Bloodborne, in terms of, okay, you go back to the hub from the lanterns or from the other bonfires, level up and do all the shit you were going to do at the bonfire in Dark Souls 1 anyway, right? And it's, and it's one of those things where it's like, technically you're correct. You can do all the same shit, and it doesn't take that long, but it is much more streamlined in Dark Souls 1. You don't have to go back to your hub. You don't have to go through a loading screen, which is the big thing, right? As he mentioned earlier on in the video, I believe this was mentioned in the part 1 I did, where he said, Bloodborne has a bit of a problem with loading screens. They kind of go on a little bit. Same thing with Demon Souls, right? These games, basically couldn't flow as well as Dark Souls 1, right, with the bonfire system in place. Now, again, people think that I'm harping on just because Dark Souls 1, I'm a Dark Souls 1 nostalgist or whatever. It's like, I played Dark Souls 2 first. Out of all the games, I played Dark Souls 2 first, right? I have no affinity for any of these things based on nostalgia, right? I like playing them all because they're all interesting in their own unique ways, even if they have some problems, which they all do, right? But again, main point is From Software has only made 2 games, as far as I can tell. I did not play Armored Core 6, so I don't know, and I didn't really get that far in Sekiro. So if there's like a progression point in those 2 games where it's like Dark Souls 1, forgive me, but it seems like the only games that I've experienced, at least, are Dark Souls 1 and Elden Ring are the only ones that did the bonfire sort of consistent playtime thing right. And Elden Ring did a great job with it as well, letting you do all sorts of upgrades and shit. But it is a thing where it bothers me how they continue to make a Demon Souls-like system when they already had a better system in place with Dark Souls. And that's the thing that really gets me, is when you have a good idea and then you backtrack it. Because one thing too is Dark Souls 1 had that system, right, of doing shit at the bonfire, but you still had hub bonfires. You still had your home base. You still had Firelink Shrine, where you could have, different NPCs there, where you could have different interactables there, right? And it's very close to a smith because, you go up the elevator and Andre's basically right there, right? It's pretty close to a lot of shit, right? So it's not like you didn't have the hub in Dark Souls 1. All I'm saying is that the bonfire, letting people do things at bonfires is a lot smoother of an experience than having to go through loading screens over and over and over whenever you want to level up or upgrade something, and that is something that, I think all the games kind of fail at after Dark Souls 1. Demon Souls I give a pass because that's kind of the first of its kind. They were ironing shit out. But when you have a good idea in Dark Souls 1 and you never use it again, until you get to Elden Ring. And even then, the Sites of Grace also have problems compared to what they did before. It's like, imagine if you could upgrade your weapon at Sites of Grace instead of doing it, at the blacksmith, at the round table hold. It's like, again, got to go through a loading screen, got to do all this shit, got to go through another loading screen to go back, when in 2011, you created a system that let players continue to play the game. They rest at a bonfire, click, 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 you're done, you've leveled up, you've upgraded your weapon, you've repaired things, now you move on. And just no other game has fucking done that. And it boggles my mind because that's a really good mechanical gameplay consistency that is really good for continuing to play the game without waiting on loading screens, waiting on going back to the hub over and over, and just staying in the moment of the adventure, right? It's just, it's a thing that just gets to me that they had such a good idea and such a good mechanical usage of leveling up, of upgrades, of repairing, of swapping things out. It's just there are so many good ideas in the Dark Souls 1 bonfire that they left at the wayside for so damn long. And it makes me wonder if they even thought about it, right? It makes me wonder if they even think about that shit with their games sometimes. It's like, for all the details that these games have, how do you fuck that up in so many games afterwards, right? Especially in like the 2 sequels to Dark Souls that should totally have that same system, right? Again, Bloodborne, different game, could do its own thing. Elden Ring could do its own thing, right? But Dark Souls 1, 2, and 3 should have had the same bonfire system, the same leveling up system. They should not have ripped off of Demon Souls over and over and over and over and over again. And even when they got back to it with Elden Ring, they still didn't do it as well as Dark Souls 1 did. Right? But anyway, that's enough of that rant. Let's get back to the video.
That the word usually does not apply here. In Demon Souls, the Nexus had merchants and blacksmiths, but here, these functions are not available on the overworld. Additionally, merchants, blacksmiths, and stockpile Thomas from Demon Souls have been replaced by mute messengers and items. The Hunter's Dream does not allow for any new NPCs to come, and so there won't be many avenues for chit-chat here outside of the Doll and Gurman. The final comparison between the Nexus and the Hunter's
And that's a extremely glaring negative that he's just kind of breezing over in Bloodborne, is that no one comes here. No one shows up here. The only people you interact with are Gurman and the doll, and that's it, right? That's a glaring negative of Bloodborne. Now, let's go back a little bit just to make sure that I didn't miss what he said. And so I get the entire thing in one go, just to make sure.
up where Demon Souls' Nexus left off, what with it being where players will usually go for upgrades and merchants, except that the word usually does not apply here. In Demon Souls, the Nexus had merchants and blacksmiths, but here, these functions are not available on the overworld. Additionally, merchants, blacksmiths, and stockpile Thomas from Demon Souls have been replaced by mute messengers and items. The Hunter's Dream does not allow for any new NPCs to come, and so there won't be many avenues for chit-chat here outside of the Doll and Gurman. The final comparison...
And there it is. There it is. It's just kind of skirting over something that could be criticized, and I am criticizing about, Bloodborne, and to an extent, is like, this is one thing that I think a lot of the other games did really well by comparison, right? And this is one thing that I think Bloodborne suffers from uniquely, is that sort of lack of different builds that have hard differentiations is kind of the core problem in what makes Bloodborne a game that I don't necessarily want to replay, right? Because when you replay the various Souls games, you often come back with a different build each time, right? Like if you play Dark Souls, your first time through, maybe you play a tank build, right? You just knuckle up and just deal with it and block shit, right? Maybe the next time you go magic, the next time you go miracles, the next time you go pyromancy, the next time you go glass cannon, the next time you go bleed, right? There are different avenues to go down, where you will replay the game, and on top of that, you replay it with different combinations of things, with hybridization builds. If you want to have something that does sorcery but also has a huge fucking glaive in the other hand, you can do that if you have the appropriate levels to allocate your stats right. And that's part of the charm of the Dark Souls games, Demon Souls, and Elden Ring, is that you can kind of mix and match things depending on what sort of build you're going for, and there's that freedom there. In Bloodborne, it's a lot more restrictive, and I talked about this in the previous video, is just Bloodborne is so focused on sort of the gimmick of its world and the gimmick of its trick weapons that it doesn't necessarily give you a lot of options in terms of how to differentiate your build. It's basically, how does the weapon work and how can I abuse its function against the enemy, right? Which is something that you can do with any weapon in any From Software game at any point, right? It's not something special to Bloodborne. Now, Bloodborne did introduce weapons that change, and that's neat, and that's pretty cool. But it does kind of streamline a lot of the builds into a single type of build, where you're kind of a melee-focused parry god, where, and you might shake it up with different, blood tinge things, and some of the crazier items in here. But again, it's not as versatile in its build setup as the other games From Software has made. And that's kind of the issue with Bloodborne in my eyes, because it affects the game in multiple ways. It affects it in terms of replay value with all the different builds that you can play the other games with. And as he just mentioned, nobody shows up in the hub because there's no reason for them to show up in the hub, because they don't have to train you in any unique sort of spell or incantation or the like, because you get it all in the overworld by picking up one item that does one thing. That's the one of 3 different items that does some sort of spellcrafty shit. Or you get just messengers that slowly unlock more and more shit, right? It's a thing where the hub doesn't really serve a purpose here besides giving you 2 characters and then an area for the finale of the game, right? And that's kind of a problem with Bloodborne intrinsically in the way it works. Is the whole point of having a hub, in my opinion, is to have multiple things happen in the hub between characters, between mechanical things, and between different groups of factions sort of doing shit, right? And again, Demon Souls did a great job of setting that up. You go there, you have that merchant right at the front, you have the level up lady, but over time you accumulate more and more people there that can train you in different sort of spells and different sorts of I forget the exact term, but like it train you in different types of magics basically. And there are different types of vendors there. You build the hub up over time, which makes it more impressive and gives you more options as the story goes along and as you progress through the game. Dark Souls 1 had something similar. The only difference is in Dark Souls, people would come to the hub, but then they would leave, right? And that's the major point, is they would leave the hub at some point, and they would continue down their quest line, right? And that's something that made Dark Souls 1 a very good mix of different things, is because you have the hub where people will arrive at it and perform some function there for you, like Laurentius with his pyromancy, right? You can upgrade his shit all the way, but he will leave once you tell him about, other flames and the swamp where we found some other shit, right? In Blighttown. Then he'll go down there and die, right? It's a part of the quest line. You use him to unlock a bunch of shit, and then you get to the end of it where he kind of goes and dies, right? And that happens to a lot of others. Sieglind comes looking for, I always forget if it's Sigward or Sigmire. I get it mixed up between Dark Souls 1 and 3. But Onion Girl looking for Onion Dad, right? And it's that kind of shit that makes Dark Souls 1 interesting, is because people will come, they'll do their own thing, but then they'll go off on their own adventure in some area of the world that fits their sort of story. In Bloodborne, you don't get any of that. You don't get any of that because they don't have that many builds. They don't have that many characters that have a function to come to the Hunter's Dream for. And then at the end of the day, you have a big open area where like 5 things happen. It's like you unlock a couple of items for online play, you level up, you buy shit from the merchants, you talk to Gurman, you upgrade your weapons. It's like, yeah, it's a hub that serves a lot of purposes, but there's no real reason to have that hub do all of that shit when you could have had it do something like in Dark Souls 1 where you didn't have to go through a loading screen and come back. And it always comes back to that, in my opinion, is part of the problem with the hubs in all the games after Dark Souls 1 is that they often just drop useful stuff that they know players will use in hubs and then force you to come back to the hub to do things, when they made a system before where you didn't have to do that. Right. And again, I think Dark Souls 1 is probably the best overall blend of having a hub, having the player have consistent play time, and having characters come and go where it feels like a living, breathing world, as opposed to everyone shows up at a particular area because you're the main character. And that's sort of a major problem I have with a lot of games in these different series, including Bloodborne, is, think about it mechanically. What's the point of having the Hunter's Dream as a hub if you could apply all of it mechanically to a lantern, for example, right? Kind of like how Dark Souls 1 did it. Imagine if you take the doll level up and make it where it works at lanterns. Take upgrading weapons, putting your runes in. Imagine all that at a lantern. And then imagine that the hub is basically just the end of the game, and you find something that takes you there, and that's the end of the game, right? And maybe you have the messengers also at bonfires, or not bonfires, or at lanterns, right? Like, think about it in terms of gameplay. How does the gameplay continue if you have the lanterns be the thing that do all the shit the hub does? And that's the thing where I think I feel like From Software chose to make these hubs and fill them with characters that do specific shit for you, rather than you doing it on the go, is to give you more characters to interact with. I feel like it's a thing where they forsook mechanical purposes and streamlined gaming, or streamlining the gaming experience, so that they can introduce new characters and have their stories play out in the hub as opposed to in the world. And I think that's something that, while I do enjoy the storytelling they have with a lot of their characters, I do think it's it's at the detriment of the mechanical usage of things in the hub, when you basically take a really great system like Dark Souls 1 had with the bonfires and all the shit you could do with it, and then spreading that out amongst a bunch of different NPCs that you run into at different times. I feel like a lot of the games are putting character over mechanics. And while I appreciate the character work they do in these games, I do think it is a bit of a problem when you take things that, games are meant to be played. They're not meant to be experienced, they're meant to be played, right? As in, you actively play, right? So in my mind, I think that they could make a perfectly good game with mechanically inclined things that help with the overall experience and lead you down some interesting paths with different people that show up at a hub that can do different things for you. And again, I think Bloodborne's a very unique case of them doing a lot of things that intrinsically hurt the entire idea of having a hub area, right? And I think Bloodborne's sort of a culmination of everything wrong with what they were trying to do with the idea of a hub, where you upgrade your, stats, your weapons, your runes, and where you have the finale of the game. I think it's a thing where they could have done a lot better with Bloodborne, given the track record of Demon Souls and Dark Souls 1. And this is one thing is, I think if they made a Bloodborne 2, they could make a really great Bloodborne 2 that could learn from a lot of the mistakes they made in Bloodborne 1. But From Software doesn't really have a history of making sequels. The only ones they did were Dark Souls. And that was it. And that's kind of a thing that kind of leaves me, wondering is, are we actually ever going to have an opportunity for them to learn from one game to the next in terms of an actual series? Because that's the advantage of having a series of games is you try a bunch of ideas in game one, you see what the community says about it, you see how many of the mechanics and the design choices they like, how many they think are okay but could be refined, and how many that they hate, right? And then you tweak it, the second game comes out, and then you learn a little bit more, about what they think of certain mechanics and ideas and such. And then that continues on down a series. Now, I don't want them to be like Call of Duty or Assassin's Creed, where they release a game every other fucking year of the same franchise, right? That shit gets old, monotonous, and boring after a while. But I do think that they would benefit from sort of mini franchises as well. Because, I mean, if a Bloodborne 2 came out and they made it a multi-platform, so not just PlayStation, that shit would sell. That shit would be just eaten up by the fans, right? And I would love that shit, right? As many problems as I have with all the different games they've made, I still like the majority of them. I still enjoy playing them a lot. And I would totally be down for a Bloodborne 2, or an Elden Ring 2, right? I would totally be down for that. But it's just a matter of they seem to want to do their own thing every single time with a new franchise that's basically a one and done sort of situation, and then they make another game that's very different. And I think there's not a lot of room. There's not as much room for an evolution of the games overall during that period, right? Because you're doing a different game each time. Yes, you will learn from previous experiments and previous games, but when you have a franchise that is built on certain fundamentals within a franchise, you can expand upon that as it goes along in a more deep way, because there are certain consistencies that need to be met. And so you have certain things that are sort of embedded in the franchise, and over time you can refine them more and more and more. That's one reason why I think Dark Souls 3 is a really, really good sequel, because it refines a lot of the shit that Dark Souls 1 and 2 did. And Demon Souls to an extent. But it was I think they could make a lot more gameplay and design sort of progress in terms of realizing ideas more fully if they had a sort of a trilogy for each sort of franchise they create, right? Like a Bloodborne 1, 2, and 3. By the time you get to Bloodborne 3, everything's going to be super refined. A lot of things are going to be very balanced. They're going to be a lot more, basically just they're going to improve the experience overall, right? And that's something that we kind of saw with Dark Souls 1, 2, and 3. As Dark Souls 3 had a lot of improvements from Dark Souls 2 and 1. That's part of the charm of that game, is because they had a franchise. It had been going for a couple of years, and they refined it over time, and they refined the same thing over time. Whenever you create something new from scratch, you basically start from scratch. Now, granted, they don't seem to start from scratch from everything I hear about their production, but still, I think it would be an overall benefit to the company and the overall series of games that they create if they have multiple sort of games within like sort of mini franchises. Like I said, trilogies are a really good way to go. You have your first game, which is a big experimental sort of try at something. The community gives feedback on it. You learn from it. The second game, you tweak things, maybe introduce a couple new things. And then you get more notes from the community again. And then you make a third game. And by that point, you've kind of tweaked the game twice over. So now the mechanics are even more refined after 2 releases, right? And that's one thing that I think this company could benefit from. But anyway, that long rant aside, let's get back into this.
Between the Nexus and the Hunter's Dream for now is that these are both the meeting place between all of your checkpoints in the game, and it's always from here that you teleport to the next one after you've talked to the level lady and cast in your XP. In Demon Souls, the Maiden in Black absorbed our held souls to grant us power. In this game, things are a bit more complicated. The Arnamites, Hemwick people, and
Again, it sounds like he's making Bloodborne seem cooler than it is. It's like the Maiden in Black absorbed the souls of whatever. It's like at the end of the day, you talk to someone and they level you up. That's what happens. Now, the context for why that happens can be different, right? But it doesn't. It sounds like Bloodborne is his favorite game, and he's making it seem like it's a better game because it's his favorite, right? It's like he's fighting with the bias, and he's arguing with the bias, internally, that this game is just inherently better because it just is inherently better, and it's the kind of thing that puts me off during the video whenever I keep seeing him do stuff like this, where it sounds like he's giving an opinion, which you are free to have, right? I'm all for opinions, every opinion, including the dumb ones. But again, it's that opinion that you think is a fact when it's not. And it's that kind of thing that kind of permeates throughout a lot of content creators' content, where they don't differentiate their opinion versus facts. And that's one thing that I myself have had struggles with as well, is, where do I draw the hard line between, okay, this is an opinion of something that I think is good, that I think is provably good, versus something that I like, right? And it's the kind of thing where it's very hard for some people to differentiate the two. And it is one thing where I just think that it would be a good idea to, sort of think about that more the next time, anybody like makes a script for a video like this, where you're going through a game in a long form sort of interactive review type of thing. Or not interactive review, but sort of a in-depth review.
In Herstians, and perhaps some of the other humans, are the descendants of Thumerians, and the appetites humans have for blood is a carryover from this genetic lineage. Thumerians are basically underground vampiric creatures. As the ages have gone on, however, and as humans have built their cities above the Chalice dungeons, they've not only forgotten their origins as Thumerians, but they've also had their lineage somewhat tainted as they've been removed from the old blood. And this thinning out of the blood resulted in humans losing the Thumerian features, like the tall cheekbones, lanky frames, and pale skin, although these features can re-emerge if the humans become familiar with the old blood again. See Canehurst. Yharnam is said to produce more blood than alcohol, since the former is more intoxicating, and this intoxication can culminate in blood drunkenness, which might have been better translated as bloodlust. As humans are exposed to more and more blood, their old nature begins to take hold, and they eventually tip over into a madness. This blood drunkenness is represented with the blood echoes. As you kill, you spread blood. As you get blood on you, your echoes begin to stack up, and eventually blood drunkenness will claim you. Except the hunter has access to the doll, who can extract these echoes and transform them into strength. Because of her, we need not fear the ravaging effects of blood drunkenness. And blood drunkenness plays a vital role in the NPC questline for Eileen the Crow.
Oh, a hunter, are you?
I'll have some choice things to say about some of the NPCs included in this game, but Eileen, I think, is a great inclusion. Not only does she have the second coolest fashion sense of the hunters we meet, Bloody Crow of Canehurst is better, but she's also got the most useful oath rune in the end of her quest. And the item she gifts us here, the Bold Hunter's Mark, is one of the more useful items this early on for newcomers and familiars alike, as they allow the player to immediately warp to their last checkpoint. Eileen is a hunter of hunters, and the way her quest builds on the idea of blood drunkenness is that just as the hunters hunt beasts, Eileen hunts blood-drunk hunters. I liked how involved with the functions of the world the doll was, and I like this about Eileen as well. And she's also a more involved NPC than any we've met outside of the Hunter's Dream thus far. Yosefka's only job going forwards will be to be transformed into a small celestial emissary, and Gilbert's only job is to gift the flame sprayer and turn into a beast. Eileen is more dynamic. She has stuff to do in the world, and your interactions with her matter as to how her story progresses. There's now only one character in this map I haven't talked to yet, and that's Gascoigne's daughter. While I get to her, I'm going to use the opportunity to talk about level design. I've already given some thoughts on how combat required that the areas be a bit more open, but there are other needs being serviced by the current layout. For one, since FromSoft had the idea of the Hunter's Dream hub in mind from the get-go, it made little sense going for a world as interconnected as Dark Souls was.
What? This world is pretty damn interconnected. It's like, yeah, you don't have to have a hub that you can actually physically go to, but I mean, that's a weird comment. Let me back that up and get the full context just to make sure that he's like leading, just to make sure that he's not just saying that to say it, and if he's leading to like a specific point.
Had the idea of the Hunter's Dream hub in mind from the get-go, it made little sense going for a world as interconnected as Dark Souls was. The interconnectedness of the world there was a tool to help the player get from A to B in a palatable amount of time, since they had to actually walk the distance in the first half. But here's the thing. For Bloodborne, even though they had to warp from the get-go, FromSoft still went the extra mile to make the game world connect somewhat sensibly together. There are seams here and there which are clearly breaking the geometry, but as it relates to Yharnam specifically, if lanterns worked like the bonfires did in Dark Souls 1, I think the setup as is would totally work. Imagine the Tomb of Erden being Firelink Shrine, and you have a hub which connects to Upper Cathedral Ward, Old Yharnam, Central Yharnam, and Cathedral Ward proper, which itself connects to Yahar Ghul. The latter half of Dark Souls gave players the Lord Vessel and the ability to warp between select bonfires in order to have the late game not be a slog to get through, since the levels needed to be distant enough from each other to allow them to have their own visual style while also being long enough to pose a challenge. If you look at Dark Souls 1's level progression, it's kind of like a tree with the early...
That's one thing that I forgot to touch on just a second ago while he was talking, is like, I completely agree with a lot of that shit. It's like the fact that they did keep, the fact that you could replace, the lanterns with bonfires and have this world work is a plus in Bloodborne's favor. But at the same time, it just goes to show that they could have done that bonfire mechanical thing like I talked about earlier in this game, and it would work, and it would make sense, and it could be useful, right? It's just, again, it's that thing where I'd rather, like, there is I guess the biggest problem I have with that and in Bloodborne is just the hub in Bloodborne does stuff that is unnecessary for the game to function the way they want the game to function. And that's something that I think Dark Souls 1 does a lot better, because there is no hub that you warp back to in Dark Souls 1. You level up where you need, wherever you happen to be, you upgrade wherever you happen to be, excluding a couple of specific upgrade points. But at the end of the day, you can progress the game in any direction and it still works, but you still have hubs. Like, you still have Firelink Shrine as a hub, right? And this game, I do think, has an interesting dynamic to it, where you could replace the lanterns with a bonfire-esque sort of system from Dark Souls 1 and the game would function like he said. And I think that would actually improve the game a lot, right? And just the only thing is, I think that they would have to rewrite and reorchestrate how the Dahl and Gurman would fit into the narrative. And it's also a thing too where they probably had the Dahl and Gurman put in very early, so that when it comes to the endings, you will have been with them throughout the entire game, right? Again, it's that thing where character seems to supplant mechanical variety and consistent playtime. But it is one of those things where I really do like the level design of Bloodborne, just like I like Dark Souls 1 and Elden Ring. It's like things logically fit together. There are some inconsistencies here and there, but they logically fit together. They do connect, and it is nice to, and it is a really good design philosophy to make the levels like a world that feels like a world for the sake of immersion, because that does affect immersion. As part of the thing with Dark Souls 2 that a lot of people complained about, is that Dark Souls 2 it feels like a bunch of different levels that were just stuck together, because you can see the hard divides of when they stuck one level to the other. Case in point is, Hade's Tower is way out of position from Majula, right? The Iron Keep is a lava-filled, like, hellscape above the Poison World, above a tower that has nothing above it, right? It's just ridiculous. It's that thing where it's just insane. This is illogical at this point. This is not, it's just incorrect from like a level design perspective. Right. And this is one thing that I think Bloodborne does do right, is that, its level design is very on point, and especially with the shortcuts and the ladders and all that other shit. I think that is a plus in Bloodborne's favor.
Early game being interconnected, but still fairly straightforward for a first timer, and the late game being splintered off into different directions. Bloodborne's map layout has these little tangents where the player is asked to go down specific dead-end paths, which they'll warp from. But aside from the road through the Forbidden Woods to Bergenworth, these are all optional. Hemwick, the Nightmare Frontier, Canehurst, and Upper Cathedral Ward don't need visiting, and if you could cut them and the Bergenworth trip from the game, the Dark Souls early game structure could have been maintained all throughout. The music box, which were gifted by Gascoigne's daughter, has a...
Okay, like he's doing a hard segue here to something else, but I do think it is an interesting thing about the games when you look at all of them in terms of how, like, what does progression look like, across the different games of the franchise? Because you get, like, Demon Souls was very much a pathway type of progression, right? Like, you had the Archstones, and then they all lead down, I think each of them lead down 4 sections? 3 sections? I don't know. I've only beaten... Actually, I've not even beaten Demon Souls. Well, I came really close, but then I got stuck on the last boss, and the king guy that, like, de-levels you with a grab. I forget his name. But, like, regardless, like, the progression of Demon Souls is, you pick a pathway, you go down to the end, and then you're done, right? There's no real reason to go back unless you missed a particular item or something. Once you reach the end, you're done with that pathway in terms of progression to quote unquote beat the game, right? To get to the end credits, to finish the game, right? And then you go down another pathway and you repeat that process until you complete all of them, and then you go fight the final boss, and then you do that shit, right? Dark Souls 1's a little bit more interesting in terms of how they affect that, because you go through the asylum, and then once you hit Firelink Shrine, you have a myriad of options in terms of which direction you can go, right? Now, you kind of have to go through most of them to get where you can complete the game, but there are a lot of options there, and one thing that a lot of people probably know is, the difference between where do you go first is, traditionally you're probably supposed to go towards the Taurus demon and the undead Berg, and then the undead Parish afterward, right? That's the most visible pathway from the bonfire. It's a clear direction of, hey, come this way. These enemies are built for low-level people. But if you know what you're doing and you have the master key, you can go down to New Londo, unlock the pathway over to the back entrance to Blighttown, and you can go around the Valley of Drakes and up into Darkroot Garden, where you can pick up a couple of interesting items, and you can basically roundabout your way to the Bell Gargoyles and Andre and Sen's Fortress, right? That's the advantage of having the world be interconnected in a way that it is because you can go to multiple places quite often, and it works on a geographical level, it works on an aesthetic level, but it also works in terms of being able to move around to different places from different angles because you can't warp. And that is one thing that I think From Software has learned over the years, is that in terms of being able to warp from place to place, it is a good idea to have warping, but when you have to do it to get out of an area, there is a problem there, right? Or when you have to warp to a place to do something, that is a bit of a problem, right? And there are some things where they're just hard, like we don't have a way to get you from A to B. Here's a teleport. A good example is the Haligtree in Elden Ring, right? You cannot physically go to the Haligtree. You have to go through a portal to get to the Haligtree, and then you just slowly work your way down to the roots, right? It's one of those things where sometimes it's inevitable, but I do appreciate the effort that they put in to make things connect and make it where you can go from point A to point B, and you can take multiple routes to get there. And another good example from Elden Ring is going from Margit to Godric. Is you can go around and go through the entire sort of castle area, right, along the ramparts and then down through the courtyard and all this shit, or you can book it past the giant, I forget what they're called, like giant arrow shooting things, ballista. Yeah, you can go, or you can try to dodge the ballista and just charge for Godric, and you can get there, right? There are different options, and they help, right? And this is one thing that I think Bloodborne is kind of similar in Dark Souls to a certain extent in terms of the actual layout of the maps. Is there are several areas that are sort of hub-ish, where it's an area that connects to different ones, and then there are a couple of pathways that can loop you around to different areas as well. It's not quite as deep as Dark Souls 1 is in terms of how the levels connect there, or Elden Ring, but it is a thing where there are points earlier on in the game, let's say in the first half of the game, where you can go to different places from different routes. But as you progress in the game, you slowly get closer and closer to the end. It does become a little bit more linear to a certain extent, because you have kind of the nightmare of Mensis going for Mikolash sort of before the end. And it's kind of a thing where you go through certain areas kind of in the same order every single time to get where you need to go, right? It's one of those things where it's not quite as free as other places. Now, it's definitely a step up from Demon Souls, and this is one thing where I think that of all the games, I think Demon Souls is probably the worst in terms of making the game feel like a world, right? Because it's just, this is pathway A, this is pathway B, this is pathway C, go down them all, and then you can beat the game. And as much as I've picked on Dark Souls 2, at least it tried to have multiple paths to go somewhere, with the Forest of Fallen Giants leading to the Lost Bastille, and Hyde's Tower of Flame leading to the No Man's Wharf, which also leads to the Lost Bastille, right? Granted, that's the one exception in Dark Souls 2, compared to the pathway shit that it does besides that. But it is a thing where all of these games have a certain level of linearity to them at some point across the thing. And it is something that just kind of takes time to kind of figure out the best way to deal with things. And there's the one thing where I've never really been on the side of no warping or all warping. I'm kind of in the middle, where I think it just depends on how you design the game. Like Dark Souls 1, I think is a good blend of it. But I do see why people would prefer something like Elden Ring, where as long as you're not in combat, you can warp anywhere that you've already been, right? And it's a thing where it's one of those things where you have to take a lot of different design choices. You have to keep a lot of design choices in mind to make the best version of a world that you can progress in and how it changes over time. And that's one thing that I think does sort of change the dynamic of each game as it goes along. But we'll probably talk about that later. I've made about 13 minutes into this video, and I've been streaming for probably about an hour. It's just, oh man, I talk about so much.
There's a few uses in this game, but most players only use it to stun Gascoigne in the boss fight. The music will remind him of home, and so it helps subdue his blood drunkenness. His wife went to find him, but she left the music box at home, so she'll have a tragic outcome. Actually, this whole family, it seems, will have a tragic outcome, but what I really want to talk about here is the use of children in these games. I don't know if it's the publishing standards at Sony and Namco or some Japanese thing, but FromSoft really goes out of their way to not show children. The Emerald Herald in Dark Souls 2 was supposed to have an appearance as a child before that game was rewritten. Gascoigne's daughter is never seen, Murgo is never seen, and Ocelot in Dark Souls 3 is never seen. We're now on the bridge leading to Gascoigne, and
a little bit of context for that. I do believe that there is a publishing rule where if you want your game to be published in certain countries, that they have rules about violence against children. Because I'm pretty sure that the Fallout games and Bethesda games, the reason you can't kill the kids in those games is because of laws like that, where if you are able to actually harm or kill a child in a video game like that, it does constitute like a breaking of the law, and so the game cannot be released in that country. So I do think there are international rules about that shit in different places, and I think From Software is just kind of playing it safe, by not showing it, sort of a thing. So just a little extra context in case people didn't know. But there are different rules across different borders that kind of relate to how you treat children in video games in terms of actual people in the game and violence towards them. And again, obviously From Software can hint to things as they do with Gascoigne's family overall, especially with his daughter. But it's also a thing where it's like, you can't really directly show the kid getting mangled, And it's one of those things where I'm not advocating for children to get killed in video games, but I do think it's kind of silly to have basically an age limit where it's like, okay, we can't show you getting hurt, but once you turn 18, we can cut your head off, rip your arms off, make you bleed profusely, and have you get chainsawed through the chest. It's like, it's a really hard line that just seems kind of retarded in my opinion, but that it is what it is.
And it has the distinct honor of housing the mandatory From Software rolling boulder trap, which is actually doubling as the From Software fire on a bridge trap, which used to use dragons. Briefly going back to discussing the map layout, as is, Bloodborne is, I think, best likened to the map structure of Kingsfield 3 or Shadow Tower 1, with the sequence shiftable semi-free roaming areas choked off with narrative bottlenecks, which lead to the next of these sorts of areas. But
again, I've not played any From Software games before the original Demon Souls in 2009, so I have no context for what he's saying about these other games. So if you've played them, let me know if what he's talking about is true or if it's utter bullshit, because I have no idea. So please help me in the comments.
Unlike Kingsfield 3 and Shadow Tower 1, once you begin to look at Bloodborne closely, you really start noticing that the progression through the world was messed around with after the world design was mostly finalized. Data mining has shown us that in one build, the game began in Hemwick, and it wouldn't surprise me if Josefka's clinic was originally designed as the end gauntlet of a path rather than the beginning, seeing as there was a large part of the clinic which was cut. Once you know how the levels were cut up and glued back together in development, it's really astonishing how well the world comes together here. We'll be fighting Gascoigne in a bit, and he is just about the strongest early boss opener FromSoft has ever given us, so we really should talk about him. The Cleric Beast has certain exploits which make that fight winnable by novices. Not just the Molotov cocktails either. Some lucky dashing and careful aiming of your gun is enough to render that fight into a breeze, but Gascoigne is a real choke point. You're not getting past him without having grasped the fundamentals of the game. The tombstones strewn around the area punish players who don't take their environment seriously. Gascoigne's hard-hitting shotgun punishes players who take their eyes away from their foes too quickly. His heavy attacks punish greedy attackers, and that he uses a trick weapon on top of everything else pushes players to adapt to the enemy rather than go in with the script. As the great Mike Tyson put it, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face. In the last part of the fight, Gascoigne transforms into an incredibly aggressive and mobile beast, so this need to adapt your strategies to him is underlined once more. But if you approach this fight with a cool mind, you'll see that the scales are actually tipped in your favor. His shotgun freezes him in a vulnerable animation. The tombstones might make maneuvering a problem, but that goes both ways. His attacks are very parryable, and the music box we got from his daughter, if the player figured to fetch it, can be played to stun him. And if all of these advantages aren't enough, the arena has stairs leading to
Erden Chapel and a broken railing which gives you a little loop back to the fight arena.
So, if at any point you need to recover, you can run away from Gascoigne and do just that. There's also to consider the narrative ramifications of this fight, as this is the first time we see what Eileen talked about with blood-drunk hunters. This fight guarantees that the players understand that idea whether or not they met Eileen. I'll be breaking continuity up a bit to quickly wrap up their daughter's questline now. The red jeweled brooch located in this area was dropped by Gascoigne's wife Viola, which he killed, and if we crack it open, we get the red blood gem, which boosts rallying potential. Judging by Viola's fate, that rally boost wasn't enough, and this brooch is better spent advancing their daughter's questline. If we return to Gascoigne's daughter and gift to her the brooch, she'll cry and eventually leave her house, only to be eaten by the gigantic pig in the sewers, as is made evident by the pig dropping the red messenger's ribbon. This quest is very strange to me because it seems like it should go into more directions than it does. I know we can talk to Gascoigne's older daughter after this part, but I'm talking about things like we can't kill the pig before talking to the little girl. Doing so will do nothing to shield her from death, but going back to what I said about FromSoft being very hesitant to shield children in their games, it might just be that having her die off screen was preferable to having her die on screen later in the game's story.
This is one thing too. Is I've seen some interesting takes on the sort of I'll call it quote unquote the daughters quote unquote of Gascoigne, because it is mentioned by the one that you encounter that she's there all alone, right? But when after she dies or after she leaves, another one appears there that is not mentioned at all by the younger one, and so it has led to some interesting theories about is this second girl just a jealous girl that wants the ribbon that the younger girl has, or is it some deranged lunatic just thinking that they're relatives or what have you? It's an interesting sort of quest line to interact with and to think about how things played out and who's telling the truth and who's just going nuts.
Now we're back on the proper path. After defeating Gascoigne, we'll be able to go to Cathedral Ward. I'm going to be finishing every quest in the game to come, with the exception of the Erden Chapel dwellers, because I don't have a lot to say about characters who just sit around while the world around them goes insane. This note hints at Rom.
That's kind of a lazy cop-out, in my opinion. It's like, yeah, I don't want to do these quest lines because these people don't move. It's like, okay, I mean, if they don't move, doesn't that make the quest line a little easier because you don't have to track them down? I don't know. That just seems kind of like a lazy thing. Now, granted, I didn't do all the quest lines in my Dark Souls 2 video. but I did mention them at points. But it is one thing where like just seems like such a lazy. It's one thing to forget. It's another thing just to say, nah, not going to do it because they're lazy. It's like, well, you're not doing it because you are lazy as well. It's like, come on.
In Bergenworth, which players won't see for a few more hours. I find these notes scattered around the world very interesting because most players won't read all of them, and most players won't even retain the information they contain so many hours after once they finally become relevant. That being said, the same can be said for the item descriptions which players get lore from. And these notes being scattered around are very easy to access, so I think more players wind up reading them than do the item descriptions. Bloodborne leans more on being a mystery than the Souls games ever did, and it's not only a mystery for the player character, but the player as well. If you go hard enough into the role-playing, you can figure out what's going on in the world on your first playthrough, but the success of lore channels says to me that most players don't.
I would kind of half agree on that to a certain extent. Like Bloodborne definitely is more of a mystery than Dark Souls 1, 2, or 3. Or well, a better comparison would be just Demon Souls, Dark Souls 1, and Dark Souls 2, since they all came out before this. But the reason I say it's kind of a half kind of truth there is like I think the success of lore channels is just because people like the entire story being wrapped up in a neat, pretty little bow. Like VaatiVidya's videos going over lore are not just a good way to get the information, but are also incredibly like well constructed, where they can get sort of the emotional impact of the story across. And it's also just they make it concise. They make it concise in an emotionally satisfying way. Which I think leads to kind of the point that people will get these stories together. It's just we like the package that these lore channels kind of bundle them up into. And that's part of the fun of watching channels like VaatiVidya and others, is that they take kind of a cool story that's broken up by a whole bunch of different shit you have to do in between chapters of the story happening. They cut out all the excessive bullshit, just show you the story, and they add some emotional weight through narration or music or what have you, in clips from the characters as they go on. So they kind of take the story, take it out of the game, like take the gameplay out of it, and then kind of focus it into sort of a mini movie type of thing, which I think is kind of the appeal. Like I'll go back and rewatch some of Vadi's videos about certain characters just because they're really well executed. It's not even really that I need to see the information in the video because I've already seen them, or I've already read them, or I've already done the quest line. It's just seeing them all in one tight little space is very nice. So, but still, it's kind of a fair point. It's like, I'm sure plenty of people did miss the quest lines and the lore and the explanations for things in these games. I'm sure they did. Right. So it's again, kind of a halfway point where you can kind of pick and choose whether you think it's, here or there.
I like these notes because they are more accessible while going through the world than stopping and reading the description of every item you pick up. And I also remember when I first replayed the game and the notes finally made sense to me. Those were very rewarding video game moments.
Very sorry. The incense must have masked your scent.
We're in the Erden Chapel now, which is an interesting place. I noted already how structure-wise this could have been Bloodborne's Firelink Shrine, seeing as it's in the middle of every other path in Yharnam, but that's not the extent to which this location is interesting to me. The Hunter's Dream is Bloodborne's version of Demon Souls' Nexus, a completely safe area which exists to give players a reprieve from the difficult levels and where they interact with characters. Except, oops, you can't send the NPCs you save to the Hunter's Dream, you send them here or to Yosefka's clinic. That seems like a vestigial element from another build of the game to me, because as is, players will have no mandatory reasons to return to this area after they've killed Vic or Amelia. And the quests here don't really get interesting until even later than that. So the NPC stories are going to have less impact than they did in Dark Souls, where Firelink Shrine was not only a gathering place for the NPCs, but was a place you constantly came back to. It feels to me like Bloodborne tried to have the best of both the Nexus and Firelink Shrine, but it's fumbling things up a bit and adapting them to this game.
If we were to consider Urton Chapel to have been a more central hub of the game,
then all of a sudden it makes a lot of sense that we're sending characters there, like we're currently doing with the old lady, because we constantly come back to meet them and see how their stories play out while we were away. But because the Hunter's Dream is the real hub of the game, for most players, I imagine that the Urton Chapel stories unfortunately take a backseat and get overshadowed by the dynamic ones we find in the game world.
I don't think that's necessarily true with some of the stories in the Odin Chapel. I think it's just a thing where they kind of, I mean, if you want just kind of a very crass interpretation of it, I think they just kind of half-assed the idea of a hub with several characters doing things and then didn't find a good way to get these characters to do anything particularly out there, like what you get in Dark Souls 1, because, when you think about it, like a lot of the characters in Odin Chapel, a lot of their quests involve things sort of locally. They don't go too far out of kind of like old Yarnum and like Odin Chapel type of thing. But when you look at Dark Souls 1, you look at Sigurd's quest line, you meet him outside of Sen's fortress, and then he's down in Blighttown, right? And you meet his daughter in the Duke's archives, and you meet her back at Firelink Shrine, and then you meet him and her, in Ash Lake. It's like they go all over the damn place, right? In Laurentius, you meet him in the depths, and he goes back to the Firelink Shrine for a little while. Then he goes down to Blighttown. I forget the lesser sorcerer name, but he shows up in sort of the lower Undead Burg. You get him to Firelink Shrine. In Logan, good example. He shows up in Sen's Fortress, comes back to Firelink Shrine. You meet him later on in the Duke's Archives. It's like characters that actually go places in the game. They're not just kind of there to like ask you to. They're not fetch quests, basically. It's like you meet them at certain points, and you meet them at certain different points that affect their storyline in some way. Another great example is Solaire. He's probably arguably the best example in the From Software catalog. It's like you meet him in the Undead Burg. He follows you. Basically he follows you in terms of like an NPC summon, for the Bell Gargoyles, for the Gaping Dragon. He helps you with, you meet him in Anor Londo. He helps you with Ornstein and Smo. He helps you with the Centipede Demon, and after that you see him at the bonfire directly afterwards, and if you fail to save him, he will die along the shortcut, back through Lost Izalith, or if you save him, he'll appear for the final fight with Gwyn, right? Like he's probably the best example of an NPC that shows up throughout the entire game, right? Pretty much, like here and there, and he's spread out across several different, and we just make several different, just a lot of different, like these characters move around basically, as opposed to these ones that don't really. But anyway, let's continue on here.
actually, the main game has one significant reason to return to the Cathedral Ward Lantern in Urton Chapel, and that reason is also used to make the player want to return to Yosefka's clinic, whose questline we're currently advancing, and that is the third umbilical cords
We pick up in the end of the game.
If they are yet human,
We know from data mining that before the game's currency was changed from actual physical blood into the more nebulous idea of blood echoes, that the game used to have NPC merchants in the world. So it's possible that those were at some point located near the Cathedral Ward Lantern, which might have given the player another gameplay reason to go there. It seems like the perfect storm may have arrived to undermine
Urton Chapel as a
significant hub. Now,
Yeah, I mean, this is one thing that is pretty evident whenever you look into the production of all these FromSoft games is that they often have a long, sort of a semi-strenuous production where some things are never fully realized, some things are incomplete, rushed, all this other stuff, right? And they're often developing multiple things at the same time. And so I think that one thing that people like to kind of forgive From Software for is kind of a lot of the unfinished shit or a lot of ideas that aren't fully developed. And in my personal opinion, I think that the best way to judge a game is once it is finished, right? Um, don't judge a game for what it could have been. Judge based on what came before and what it is after it's been fully patched, right? And that's something that I think a lot of people kind of like to forget at times when they look at these games, where you get a lot of different reasons for why certain things are the way they are, why certain areas might be lacking, certain quest lines may have been developed but not implemented, all those other things, right? In my mind, it's a thing where it's like complaining about deleted scenes in a movie that were never added later. It's like they were never added, they're not a part of the movie. At the end of the day, the movie is what the movie is. Similarly with a game. Now, unlike movies, games can be patched, right? So things can be fixed post-release, right? But movies, largely, once you get the movie, that's the movie, right? You can't change any of the shit in it. Same thing with games after they've been patched. It's like if they don't fix anything, if they don't add anything after all the patches, after all the updates, after all the DLC, then you're kind of left with what the game is, right? And we kind of have to judge them accordingly based on that. We can't judge games based on what they could have been, right? Because plenty of games would get a pass that are absolutely terrible or have a lot of problems. It's like we need to judge them for what they are, not what they could have been. And that's something I see a lot of people. They try to give a lot of sympathy to a game that probably needed more time, probably needed more direction, or needed just to finish something that they didn't finish for whatever reason, right? At the end of the day, I don't think it's necessarily the reason why they didn't finish it that's the problem. I think it's the fact that they didn't finish it at all that is the problem, right? And I think that's the thing where at the end of the day, I don't care if there was a great area that was cut from the game. The fact that it's not there just shows that they didn't finish it. That's on them, right? Kind of the way I look at everything with all these games and all this other shit. Is like if they don't manage to finish it, if they rush it, if they make something shit, it's still shit, right? Like the Bed of Chaos as a fight, and that whole area was rushed, and that's pretty well known. But it is a thing where I do think that they really do need to, people need to really judge games based on what we get, not what we could have got, but what we get. Because Bit of Chaos, in theory, sounds great, but the way it's implemented is very bad. And we shouldn't give it a pass because it should have been good. We should criticize things based on what they are, not what they should have been. Again, but anyway. But I am running out of time right now, sadly. But this has been fun so far. I have not been able to get very far in this video. I'm getting about 20 minutes of stream, which is not great. But it is something that I think I'll probably have to work on in the future, is just trying to get through this damn video, because 20 minutes for like an hour and a half per time is like, damn, this is going to take forever to get through. But yeah, that's going to be the end of the stream. So just let me know what y'all think of all these streams I've been doing lately. I'd love to do more, and I look forward to next time. And so I'd just like to thank you all for watching, and I will see you guys later.